Hi everyone and welcome back on my channel. In this episode we're going to talk about the Sony A7R V, a camera that has introduced the next generation autofocus system by Sony and will focus specifically on bird photography. Let's get started. I'm not going to spend too much time here because the A7R V shares the same design of the latest A7 cameras like the A7 IV. It's a weather-sealed and compact body. There are a lot of physical controls and a lot of customization, not only with the buttons but also with the function menu and the My Menu section. You also get the latest additions like the photo video lever you see here. It has a decent grip at the front, although as I said many times, I find it a bit small and uncomfortable with large lenses, unless of course you get a battery grip or a grip extender. The viewfinder is one of the absolute best you can find, with superb resolution, large magnification and a fast frame rate. I find it comfortable when wearing glasses as well. The most noticeable upgrade on the A7R V is the rear LCD. At first, it looks like the standard vari-angle monitor that you can flip on the side and rotate 180 degrees, but then you can also tilt it up and down just like that. It should please users that like the classic multi-angle mechanism, but also those that prefer the two-axis up and down movement. I think it's very clever and it seems very robust. There are two memory card slots and they are hybrid. You can insert two SD UHS-2 cards or two CF Express Type A cards. CF Express cards are more expensive, but as we'll see later on, they are faster and help with buffer, among other things. The battery is the same as other Sony cameras, the NP-FZ100, but I found battery life to be inferior on the R5 model. For example, after a 2-hour session at the Red Kite's feeding station with around 1500 images and a few 4K 50p video clips, there was 28% of battery life left. With the A7 IV in the same shooting conditions and with the same settings, I would have at least 40 or 45% of battery juice left. Finally, a quick look at the physical connectors. You get a full-size HDMI, flash sync socket, microphone input, headphone output, 10 gigabit per second USB-C and a smaller and older micro USB port. Inside the A7R V, we have the same 61 megapixel sensor of its predecessor, the A7R IV, and it's a great sensor with plenty of resolution and no low-pass filter, so you can capture very sharp and crisp details. Such high resolution is also great for wildlife. You have more room for cropping in post, and even if you decide to use the APS-C mode, you're still capturing 26 megapixel images, so that offers great versatility in addition to using long focal lengths and teleconverters. Dynamic range is very good, as you can imagine. Here is a quick example with a strong 4 stops exposure recovery in Lightroom, just to see what happens when you push the sensor a bit far. There are still plenty of details left and not too much noise. This is how highlight recovery looks like, which is very good and on par with other fine sensors from Sony, like for example the 33 megapixel version found in the A7 IV. Let's have a look at the ISO performance now. This is the range of this camera, and this is how it performs. I'm showing you the native 100% crop from the 61 megapixel images, so obviously there is noise, but I find the quality really good overall if you think about how much resolution there is. And of course, you can downsize your image, use a noise reduction software, so really noise is not a big concern with this camera in my opinion. Okay, this is the star of the show. What I described to you until now is more or less what you get in the A7R IV minus the LCD mechanism, But the autofocus is entirely new. There are more phase detection points, but the real upgrade is found with subject detection and deep learning technology. Sony has designed a dedicated processing unit for this, what they call the AI processing unit, that is an extra chip put inside the camera solely for the purpose of better subject recognition. It uses detailed information about human forms and positions to track people more accurately, but it can also recognize a vaster range of subjects, as you can see in this table. Concerning animals, Sony said there is an improvement of 40% in performance because this new AI technology can detect smaller animals and it can also recognize heads and bodies, not just the eyes. With static subjects like birds in trees, branches, the performance is certainly impressive, particularly when the animal is positioned backwards or with foreground elements in the way. The A7R5 always understood there was a bird in the frame and kept focus on it 99% of the time. Here is facing the other way initially, but the R5 has already the head in focus, and when the bird turns around, the eye is perfectly sharp. You can get the odd image with the wrong focus distance, but the rate was pretty low with that. Now, this level of performance is not entirely new to me. I got very good results with other Sony cameras that have bird detection, such as the A1 and the A7 IV, including when the bird was partially covered by branches or leaves. But the main advantage of the A7R5 is that when the eye of the animal is not visible because he is in the shade, because he's too far, or because he's facing the wrong way, the camera will concentrate on the head or the body rather than just reverting to the normal tracking mode. The R5 understands there is an animal in the scene, no matter the condition, and that means focus will stay on your subject more easily. Another good example is when the bird is small in the frame. In these next images, the camera was very accurate in keeping focus on this tiny pied wagtail, whereas with the normal tracking method, it would have probably lost it more easily in favor of the grass and dirt in the foreground or background. For every subject detection type, including birds, the A7R5 lets you fine-tune the performance with three new settings: tracking shift range, tracking persistence level, and recognition sensitivity. Let's see what they do. Tracking shift range is quite interesting. You're basically telling the camera if it should track only the subjects that are inside the focus area or track those that are outside and how far outside. Here is a very simple example with the expand flexible spot area. The range is set to 1, which means narrow, so it should only track the subject if it is inside my focus area. When I move the point and it's not over the bird anymore, the camera ignores the subject and focuses where the area is. Now, if I change the setting to 5, aka wide, and try to focus again, you can see it detects the eye and goes straight for it, even though my focus point is barely touching the stuffed toy bird. The second new setting, tracking persistence level, basically tells the camera what it should do if the subject you're following is no longer visible, because it has become out of focus, for example, or because it went behind trees. Should the camera keep searching in the same area, or should it track another subject in the foreground as soon as possible, if there is one, of course? Here is another example. I have two subjects and I'm focusing on the one on the left. Then I cover it with a black cloth so it's not visible anymore. If the level is set to 5, locked on, you can see the camera still searches for a little bit and then switches to the other subject on the right. If I set it to 1, meaning not locked on, the A7R goes for the bird on the right more quickly. Now, it's important to understand that this second setting will be influenced by the first setting I described earlier, which is tracking shift range. If your range is set to narrow and you're using a small focus point, then it doesn't matter what persistence level you set because the camera will only track what's inside the focus area and where the focus area is. I think the second setting is more useful if you have a large area like zone, where it's more likely to have two subjects inside and where the persistence level can be more effective. Setting number 3 is called recognition sensitivity, and this is the one I found to be the most useful. If you see that the camera is struggling to detect a subject or recognizes the body but not the eye, you can increase the sensitivity to 4 or 5. Reducing the level can avoid false recognition if the camera confuses something else for an animal or bird. Here we have another example where initially only the head is detected, but when I set it to 5, increasing the sensitivity, the eye is detected right away. I find the third setting useful with distant birds, particularly when they were flying. With these red kites small in the frame, the camera was not detecting them at first, using the default focus points instead, but after increasing the level to 5, it started to recognize the body, and that helped the camera minimize the chance of focusing on the background rather than on the bird itself. Likewise, with a small bird on a branch, if you cannot get closer to him, raising the sensitivity will help recognizing the subject and make sure it focuses on the eye, which is what you want. There is something important to understand. These three new settings are quite advanced, and one reason I'm saying this is because I didn't get the same behavior every time, especially with the second setting, tracking persistence level. I think it can vary depending on the exact subject, the exact action, and the exact situation, and also other autofocus settings can have an impact on these new ones, like if you work with a larger or smaller focus area. So, my advice is this: don't touch them right away. Leave them as you found them with the factory settings. And when the camera is not focusing properly or not recognizing a subject, that's when you can try to change these. And I would start with the first one and the third one, leave the second setting for last. In the menu, you can select animals and birds together as the subject to detect. If you know you'll encounter different types of animal, you can also give priority to one over the other. You can also decide if the camera should recognize all the parts of the animal or being limited to the head and eye only or just the eye. Personally, I didn't find any advantage in changing this, so I've left it with the full body head eye recognition. Now let's talk about my birds in flight test. And if you are hoping to see a higher score with this new camera, that's unfortunately not the case. Frankly speaking, the A7R5 behaves like its predecessor, fast in locking to the subject, very good tracking capabilities, rarely misfocuses on the background, but there is also a problem with focus accuracy. Here is my autofocus score, and as you can see, the best result I got is a few points below the A7R4 and definitely inferior to other Sony cameras like the A7 IV or the older A9 Mark II. I tried a lot of different setting combinations, and this is the one that gave me the best score of 84%. But I have to say, the same precise settings on a second day of shooting delivered a lower score of 78%. And interestingly, switching subject detection off and just relying on the normal tracking mode kind of delivered a very similar performance. The only main difference is that without subject detection, the camera was a bit more prone to focus on the background when the bird was small in the frame. So why the 7R5 didn't get a better score? Well, a good amount of photos were slightly off concerning focus. You get a shot that is perfectly sharp like this one, where you can appreciate all the details on the animal, and then the next 3 or 4 images are slightly soft. The sharp details are just gone. This is an interesting example because the bird is against the blue sky, it's a sunny day, it's well framed. You would think this should be easy enough for this camera and its super duper AI power. But actually, the A7R5 had less issues with a busy background rather than with a clear background, which was surprising. For the record, the A7R5 is not a bad camera for birds in flight, but I was expecting a better performance than its predecessor. Perhaps it needs some tweaking at a software level and maybe we'll get some firmware updates in the future. Perhaps some of the new settings I described before are better designed for other type of situations, Or maybe this new autofocus system will work better with a camera that has a faster processing and calculation speed like the A1 or a future A9 Mark III. The last point I want to make in this chapter is that the best AF performance for birds in flight came about after trying all sorts of combination with these new settings, which means the A7R5 is a much more complicated camera to configure than any of its predecessors, when it comes to autofocus at least. The A7 series has always been the easiest one to set up because there were only 2 or 3 settings to worry about, and there were basic settings like, which focus area to use. Sony always had an autofocus that was smart enough to understand where the subject was and rarely confused it with the background or something else. And I'm talking even A7R Mark III, A7 Mark III, the old generation. I would have thought that increasing the deep learning capability would have made the process even easier, not the contrary. Now, it's great Sony added these settings, don't get me wrong, at least we can intervene and improve the performance, but I'll be curious to test this again later on, maybe with new cameras, to see where all of it is going. There isn't a lot to say here. The A7R5 has a maximum continuous shooting speed of 10 frames per second, like its predecessor. The speed doesn't change whether you use the mechanical shutter or the electronic shutter, but the sensor readout is not very fast on the A7R5, so I would definitely stick with the mechanical shutter. One thing to know is that if you choose uncompressed or lossless compressed RAW, the drive speed is slower. I timed it around 6.7 frames per second, and that includes all the lossless RAW options, large, medium, and small. To get the full speed of 10 frames per second, you need to work with compressed RAW or JPEGs. Buffer is pretty good if you use CF Express cards. As you can see, it actually never slows down whether it's compressed RAW or JPEGs. With a SD card, the speed becomes slower after 10 seconds if you shoot RAW. The A7R5 can record in 8K in 24 and 25p and in 4K up to 60p. However, there is a 1.24 times crop when you do that. The quality in 8K is really good, you get lots of sharp details. However, 4K 50 and 60p is much softer. I think the camera line skips so you don't get super crisp details anymore like the other Sony 4K cameras. If you want the best quality in 4K, you have to work in Super 35 mode, which is the APS-C mode, and that means a 1.5 times crop. Here we have a few samples recorded in 4K at 50p. These were taken handheld with the 200-600mm lens, and they showcase a decent performance with the Sony stabilization system. I didn't have time to test in depth every aspect of this camera, this is why I was very quick in some parts of my review. But another upgrade I want to mention briefly is the in-body image stabilization. This is the first Sony camera with a rating of 8 stops of compensation. Obviously, when dealing with wildlife and long telephoto lenses, the performance is very much influenced by the optical stabilization on the lens. But otherwise, with normal lenses like a 35mm prime, the A7R5 is capable of giving you better results than previous E-mount cameras. You can also push slow shutter speeds a bit further, so there is an improvement there. Right, time to conclude the video. Regarding wildlife and bird photography, I think the main appeal of this camera remains the sensor and the 61 megapixels, just like its predecessor. It delivers fantastic image quality as well as more versatility when you need to crop. The new autofocus system is very interesting, very promising, helpful in certain situations, but is also more difficult to configure, and for fast action like birds in flight, it didn't make a substantial difference, at least with the subjects I tested. That's it then. Thank you for watching. As usual, don't hesitate to leave a comment. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.